What is up, folks? It is time for the High Tech Podcast, brought to you by Harness Tech. That's right, we're back. It's a new year, a new time, and we are totally recording in 2025. That's for sure. If anybody tells you differently, they're wrong. My name is Josh Schwartz. I'm one of the hosts of the High Tech Podcast, and that voice you heard right there, it's not a mysterious person. I don't know. I was gonna say something and I had nothing in the hopper. That's just the other host of the High Tech Podcast, the great William Illingworth. Please talk for a second so I can stop saying stupid things.
Not the great. I mean, I'm not quite golden pipes like Mileto, but I'm definitely maybe going for like a bronze to silver pipes. I'm on my way.
Nice. We should do an entire episode where we try to talk like Steve Mileto, like we do.
Oh gosh,
like his voice.
I think that
would be great. Steve, I know you're probably listening to this episode, so that's why we keep referencing you now. It's just little plugs to really mention to you. No, we are excited to be back for another year of the High Tech Podcast. As you're listening to this episode, you will have finished your Christmas or holiday gatherings plus the new year. And hopefully you're feeling good. Hopefully you have recovered. Because this is releasing several days.
You went hard.
Yeah, you went hard into what you were doing. But we are excited to be back for a fresh new year of content. And boy, do we have some exciting stuff coming this year. I am super excited about some of the episodes we're about to do. This episode's going to be fun. The next episode's going to be fun. We're still planning some of the middle of the episodes. We have ideas that are floating around that have not sat down, but I can tell you there's going to be an incredible series this year where Will and I are actively going to be doing things. I'm not going to tell you what. There might be some cooking involved. There might be some building involved, whatever it may be.
He's not going to tell you, but hey,
it's going to be an experience. Well, I've alluded to things, that's broad enough. Sure. Maybe we're building.
It's all going to be in Minecraft. It'll be fine.
Yeah, it's basically a Minecraft themed series. No, but super excited for the new year. Before we do all that, just a reminder, if you came here for the first time or you have been coming and listening to the High Tech Podcast, but not listening to us when we ask you to do these things, please make sure to subscribe or like or follow us on the socials and all the other web areas. We have tons of social media online. You can find us at High Tech Podcast or at High Tech Pod. Make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the High Tech Podcast. It's super helpful for us. And make sure you know when new wonderful episodes are releasing. A reminder as well, if you want to get a hold of us, you want to be on the podcast, you want to just say something nice, something mean you can hear too, but I prefer for it to just be nice. You can hit us up at inbox@hightechpod.us. And then also a reminder, we are on the internet. You can find us at hightechpod.us as well. So make sure to go check out our website to find all of our fun episode pages.
Boom.
We have lots of great stuff. Yeah. Make sure to go hit that up. So anyway, for this episode today, though, we've got lots of fun things to talk about. Well, I kind of wanted to go back to the course design side of the High Tech Podcast and talk about specifically how, in our opinion, how to design a successful course. When I emphasize in our opinion, because Will and I aren't right about everything. Most things, because we have a podcast. So, if you have a podcast, you're usually right. Right. That's how it works, kind of. So, we're going to talk a little bit about how to design a successful course. Will and I have designed a lot of different courses, helped to build them, and I think we have some opinions on how to do this. And so, we wanted to share a little bit of our thoughts, our experiences, what we've learned, what we've seen work, what we've seen not work, and kind of talk through that. So kind of the idea of this episode is let's pretend you're about to design a course. Okay? And I think a lot of the principles Will and I are going to talk about could fit to if you're designing a training course, if you're designing a live course for college or schools or whatever, or you're designing a live training, or an online course or training. I think a lot of what Will and I are going to talk about could fit any of those things. I will admit some of mine is probably going to go a little bit more on the digital side component, because that's where my passions are, but that's kind of where we're at. So let's all come together with Will and I and imagine you're about to start a course. Hypothetically, it's on tanks. because Will and I have designed a course. You did it. We didn't even coordinate that together. That was fantastic.
Yep.
Introduction to Tanks, TNKS 101.
101.
I think somewhere we have a micro learning course about tanks. I created one once.
We
right?
did it in like an LMS or something. I forget.
Yeah,
You're
it was
right.
like some kind of
built
micro learning thing that we were interested in at the time. So
yeah.
if you're about to start designing a course, Will, what do you think top thing in the beginning to make sure your course is successful? What do you need to do?
I'm gonna do one off outline thought, which is don't.
No, unacceptable. We have like the most basic outline, and you're already not following it. Yeah, folks, we literally just have 5 points on a page. It's outline. And Will's already not following that outline.
That's what I do. It's just a very nice and gentle don't for all of the designers and people you're gonna work with. Don't do it in a week, or in 5 business days. This didn't recently happen to me. I don't know what you're talking about. It's worth taking your time with this, because like Josh made the point, we've got a 5-point outline here about where to start in the process and how to make sure you're kind of checking in and building or designing even sequentially and following a backwards design model maybe. But time is a significant element to designing. So if you're going to consider designing an entire online course or one little video, whatever it is, make sure you allot the appropriate amount of time so that everyone can be successful. Let
me play devil's advocate for a second. I'm going off the outline now. You're starting a different topic. Is time always a necessity, right? Because here's the most common complaint I hear from instructional designers, from teachers, from everybody in this field. When a course doesn't go well, most people will go, well, we didn't have enough time to create it. Like that's usually the default.
Right.
Like we didn't have enough time. Like if I had $1 for every subject matter expert during the period of time when I was involved in that huge initiative where we built like over 100 courses in a year,
it's not enough time.
It's not enough time, right? Like, and listen, I do think you need appropriate time. I'm not saying create in a day, and I'm not saying you create an entire academic course in 5 days. That's probably a bad idea. Okay, I want to just throw all those out there. But like, is time the most important thing? Or are there some things that are more important to make sure you're doing? And even if you don't have a ton of time, as long as you do those things as carefully as you can within the time you're given, your course will at least be somewhat successful, right?
I think there's a 3-part balance. It's kind of like the old thing in college, like, you can get your homework done, you can have a social life, and you get good grades or whatever it is. You can sleep, you can get good grades, you can have a social life, and you can pick 2 of the 3 things. It's just a joke. It's not really real, because I managed all 3 mostly.
Yeah, that's interesting. None of us really liked you back in college.
Respect. I don't know why any of you stuck around. Of the 3 things, it is kind of time, content, and the way we're going to deliver the content. Like sometimes people freak out, like you're not going to get all the content into the course. How can we ever get all of this content into one course? And then there's people, it's like, well, if we had all the time in the world, then we could put all the content in. Well, we don't have all the time in the world, so we can't put all the content in. But I think the third thing that kind of works on this little rotation or this correlation is the way we deliver the content. So the lesson that I'm speaking to on this recent thing is I did manage to build a course in 3.5 business days. But when I look at it, the end product has just piece after piece after piece that I would not have done. Right? I had to make a sacrifice with 3.5 days as the priority that we did not do great screen recordings. We just didn't. Just the mouse, no pausing, no highlighting, no nothing. There was nothing on screen except the mouse moving around and clicking on things on screen, which isn't the worst case scenario, but I do like when there's a screen recording involved to ensure that the mouse is big. If we can put a circle around the mouse, can we highlight it when it clicks? Can we put boxes around things we're trying to talk about, whatever, you know what I mean? But version 1 measured against the time allowed meant that we had to do it the way we did. And so we met the deadline and something went live. Like, I think to your point, maybe a successful course doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah. I think maybe
The
what I'm
more time
asking
we
is,
have,
yeah, I think what I'm asking is like, we need to go back for a second before screw our outline. We have to go back for a second before we get into our outline. Okay. What is a successful course? What's a successful training? Right? What's like my definition for successful training or successful course would be this: within the time that you have you been able to get the learner to the goals that you set from where they're at? Okay.
Right.
If you can do that, then it's a successful training. Was it rocky along the way? Sure. I didn't say a perfect training. Like a journey can be successful and not perfect, right? Like I can say I'm gonna travel from PA to California. I'm not sure why I would do that, but I'm gonna do that. And it may be horribly rocky along the way, but if I got there alive, I'll put that statement on there, that it was successful, essentially. I mean, like it
course accomplished,
goal, right? So, like, I think the point is time, yes, factor, but time is part of what's dictating of what goal you're going to be able to do, right? So, like,
absolutely,
obviously, I would say building a full 16-week academic course in 5 days is a bad idea and shouldn't be done. But that's because the time allotment you've given is not going to allow for that course to be successful, because if you've got to have that much content, that much course to get them to the goals that you're going to have, you're going to need more time to develop to get them there, depending on what
5 days only works.
The course is 80% done, and those 5 days just you needed to get to
or no one sleeps. There's zero sleeping. You don't sleep for 5 days.
I'm being a little facetious and kind of a jerk.
Yeah.
But like the point is that's what successful course I think in our mind is. I think we'd agree in that. No matter
we're
the timing,
both, I think, processing and we're both processing and reacting to though things that have hey, listener, this is what we deal with, right? I got pinched. I got made to make something in 3.5 days, but Josh has also been with folks where he's successfully delivered things on tight timelines again and again and again, where somebody, people complained the entire way through that it wasn't enough time. We all want more time. That's absolutely. But like, I think there's a big lesson to be learned here about the successful course is there is a relationship. What Josh brought forward is actually maybe most important in a course, even over what I said. I'm like pinched off of what something just happened in my own real life, and
I've been
Josh's
there too.
Point is actually,
I'm being kind of obnoxious about it, but I've absolutely experienced that.
This is perfect. This is how we make content, right? We need to disagree with each other, or we need to make conversation. But if we're thinking about training, if we're thinking about a course, the pedagogical goal is the most important thing. What are we trying to get the learner to learn? If we want a successful course, and that course is about making a tank, well, holy smokes, making a tank, whether it's actually making the tank or it's learning how to make the tank, right? The amount of time that goes into one of those two courses is dramatically different. Making or even learning how to make are two different things, but those are different than just driving the tank, right? A course on driving the tank should be more simple, less content than a course about making a tank from scratch. Now, of course, we're using our ridiculous Tanks 101 example here, but that learning objective will drive the time needs, right? So if I'm going to just teach someone how to drive a tank, I need 6 weeks. If I'm going to teach someone how to make a tank, I need 3 years. Whatever it is, it's going to be dramatically different. And that's I think definitely number one here is setting a good understanding for that successful course, what the goal is, because even the course that I just dealt with, we only got it done in 3.5 days because the goal was on Bloom's taxonomy, just the most must be able to identify kind of goal possible. There was no depth to the learning experience. They were being introduced to a topic, and it was acceptable for them just to watch, do a couple click throughs. We had 12 questions, right? So we made it. We made it work in 3.5 days. But if you're trying to teach somebody how to drive a tank, it's just even that is going to need more time than 3.5 days to build it and then create it and deliver it.
Yeah, I would agree.
Is there a pivot back to the outline, or you got more?
No, we'll go back to the outline. Okay, so let's say you're beginning it, right? And you've gotten past the obnoxiousness of Will and I talking about that. At the end of the day, successful course is You need to know where you're going and where your learners are at. So for me, to do that well at the beginning, you need to understand two things. What is the goal, right? Who is the learner? And what does the learner have to do that they don't already know how to do, right? Or say or whatever, right? So these are just components, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to do this. And there's some stuff that I've been currently looking at that we're trying to take our current team towards that involves in like an agile methodology. But there's some stuff like, so if I'm going to define where I'm going to go, right? Some of this is going to be setting learning objectives, but realistic learning objectives, right? So like my learning objectives in an academic higher ed course might look very different than training courses that I've developed, right? Because usually in those courses I have more time with them. So my objective might be a little bit more lofty, right, than what my objective would be in a training course. But the core of any objective is going to be that it's something that can be measurable. And I want to point out something measurable in the course, right? So I came across this recently where like in corporate, people were developing e-learnings and their goals were like they had to do a specific type of thing, right? And there was clearly some like on the job training that would happen after the course was over. But that wasn't a part of the training curriculum that we were developing. That was a separate element, right? So that thing, in my opinion, has separate goals, right? That's not our goals. That's not my goal for the course. That's a separate thing, right? My goal for the course might be to help prepare them for that, but their goals for the course were like, they'll be able to actually do these things by the end of the course. And I remember bringing up, I was like, that's not, like, they're not going to be able to do that and articulate storyline. Like, how are you going to... How are you going to be able to be able to check that they can do that thing, right? Like in the storyline course. And so I pushed that, like, the goal needs to step back a second. It's too lofty. It's something beyond what your course is going to be able to do and evaluate. So what can the course do and evaluate, right? And that's where I think you need to be successful in setting the goal. It needs to be measurable, but measurable within the course's ability, right? Like in a counseling course, can I measure in the course and the time that you have that they're going to be able to successfully counsel someone? I might be able to with some simulation and some things, but if you don't have time to do that in the course, then you're not going to be able to do that. Just quizzing them on whether or not they knew the terminology isn't going to tell you whether they could successfully counsel someone.
Yeah. And to your point of successfully counseling someone, that the actual interaction of that is two humans. Like, you can simulate it, but now if you simulate it, the objective becomes, can they, in a test environment, demonstrate the behaviors needed to counsel someone, right? Very different wording from can they successfully counsel someone to can they, in a test environment, demonstrate the ability or the skills needed to, and that's very real, right? You know, as a counselor, you should have active listening skills. You know, you're demonstrating behaviors like eye contact, face positioning. You literally should be looking straight at your person, your patient, instead of looking to the side or kind of get droning off. Like, there's behaviors you could really test for in a test environment. You could do that just by having someone look at the camera and record them, and that's a real thing. Can you test whether or not they've successfully counseled someone? That requires, with the learner, setting a baseline, creating an intervention, and then doing a post test. And it's not necessarily something you're going to be able to do in a clinical counseling context. So, we can play out this counseling thing, but even tanks, our whole thing about tanks is we use it as a joke because it's ludicrous. We unless you're in the military, the idea of a tanks class is not possible. We're not going to do it in a civilian context, and we can't get tanks. We can't let people drive them. Maybe someday we think about VR, but like seriously, today, if you want to do a class about tanks, it's going to be a history book, or it's going to be, diagrams and icons and images. We can't give that kind of course. So you've got to, like Josh is saying, knowing where you're going is very important, because if you want to teach tanks, well, you have to set your limits. First, the fact that you're going to teach everything you possibly can about tanks up to getting in a real one. So none of your learning objective can include driving the real tank.
Yeah, unless you can
It's
actually get them there. Your course gets them into the real tank and they're driving. You know what I mean? And
for our folks in
obviously, that's the
military
thing.
education.
Yeah. So yes, you need clear goals, but I would take this a step farther. And this is coming out of some stuff I've done, both in what we've done in Harness Tech when we've been developing things. I've done some side projects, and we're actually now currently even working with my current team that I'm involved with to get them to develop this into our process. But so this comes out of Agile. It's a concept called user stories. Like, Will, have you ever? I don't know if you've done this with me or not. User stories. I've done it in Harness Tech for
I'm
stuff.
familiar with
not,
it, but no.
So like the concept behind a user story is it's something that comes out of Agile project management. But I think it has a broader role for this. We're currently reading through a book called Agile for Instructional Designers, which is a great book. Highly recommend it. But she has the author has a format in there, and she talks a little bit about user stories as well, and even recommends doing them in development, in design. And I agree. Basically, what a user story is you take and go. It's basically a brief statement of value, right? So it's different than a learning objective. Right? A user story can often be confused with a learning objective, but it is different, right? A learning objective, I'm saying in the learning objective, by the end of this training, this course, the learner will be able to do this, right? A user story is different. I'm saying I, as the teacher, the instructor, this is often something I'd work with an SME to develop, right? Let's say I, as that person, want or need the learner to be able to do this in the course and give the reason why. So it's basically I, as a person, user, whatever, want, then you state the goal that you want, and then you state the reason for that goal, right? And the reason this is different than an objective is because an objective is saying by the end of the course, the learner will be this. Right. A user story is saying to get me to that goal, I want the learner to be able to do this, or replicate this, or say this, or learn this, whatever, so that they'll be able to get to that goal, or be able to get to this thing, or they'll be able to do this that will build on this, right? So user story might not be just 3. You might lay out a bunch of them. The reason I'm talking about doing this is because this is something I'd lay out in planning to design that can drive then the features or things I'm going to do in my course or training, right? Those value statements help drive that. So that'll help drive me to, well, if I need them to be able to, I'm teaching Tanks 101, and I, as the instructor, want my students to be able to tell me the parts of a tank so that they understand the makeup of their tank or whatever. This is a bad user story because I don't know, Will and I don't know tanks well enough to actually really define it well enough.
Not yet.
Yet. But if I know that they're going to be doing this at this point, then that dictates for me the type of assessments or activities I might include, or the type of content, right? So if I need them to be able to know how to combine the parts together to make a tank, then I'm going to need to make sure that my course covers that concept and that I assess that concept, so that I'm assessing that idea, right? So like that's where I really like user stories. There's also this idea that we've been recently looking at on my team called action mapping, where you'll lay out the different actions that they have to do to get to those user stories, and then map out the different things or components they're going to have to need or know to get to there, right? So that's a very like practical training method version, right? But you can do that in a lot of different places, a lot of different courses, concepts. But these practices are going to help me get to ultimately what I think you need to do well to build a successful course. You need to know your goals, and then you also need to know how to get to those goals. What are the things that are going to need to be done, and why? And what value do they add to your course? And that sounds really like, that sounds self-explanatory, but I mean, Will, how many times have we worked with people that like you'll have learning goals, they'll have a textbook or a book or like a tool that they need to train on, and then people just start tossing out ideas for what needs done in the course, and nobody really stops to think, what value is that thing adding to the course to get them to the goals? Right? I'm not saying it might not have value, but nobody's intentionally thinking about that before they get into the course.
Yeah. And to your point about like getting those few things together, what they typically do, in my experience, is they write those learning objectives, personified by my water bottle here. So they write these, They get the course together and then they throw the learning objectives away. Like nobody cares about them even while they get into things. Like
they
one of the things,
arbitrarily connect them to something, right? They'll like still there. They'll connect them to something. But there's never clear. Yeah.
One of the things that I've really appreciated about watching your journey in instructional design and even participating in it with like harness tech stuff is that you hold people to the process, where I have seen and been the designer where I watch people, I walk up to people like, hey, so let's, start with some of these things we're talking about. Let's get some learner assessment. Let's make these, and we write all of it down and we take the time and we go through the activity to kind of get these foundational elements together. And then this is going to help maybe hopefully bridge us into the middle a little bit here. But once we've done all that foundational work, they leave it behind. No matter how many times I kick and scream and drag to try and pull people back to, but remember those learning objectives, or remember where your learners are, or whatever. A lot of folks lose it once they get beyond the foundational steps. And I think that there's a couple of different reasons for that. One being just like technology differences. I've worked with a lot of faculty who just were not tech interested or savvy. I don't think that tech savviness is an issue with instructional design, but we're talking about a digital medium. And if folks can't keep up with the materials, or they lose track of it, or they don't like working in OneNote, or they don't like working in Wrike, or they don't like working in Google, whatever it is, right? That can be a big issue. But I think this is definitely one of those points where in my opinion, the biggest value that the instructional designer has is what you do, Josh, is hold the stakeholders or the SMEs to the foundational elements and remind them and stay strong to it. And when needed, compromise and find room for adjustment. But like when you and I have done our storyboards as an example, like that's a pretty good early design stage thing. Like we might want to, maybe we've got the user stories together, we've got our objectives together, and maybe now we start to build the storyboard. But once you've got pieces like that built, using them throughout the development and throughout the design process is pretty dang important. And I've seen how successful it is with you. I've only ever had struggles, and even just a month ago in my day job, trying to get an SME to work with a storyboard that they just ignored. They eventually they never opened it beyond the time that I showed it to them to use, and they showed up to me with all this other scripts and things that they had just built out of their own time. So how do you say we go from this beginning stage where maybe I'm starting to get these foundations together, and then the stakeholder, the SME, goes away? What do we do to keep this continuity going, this flow going, where we're establishing the objectives, we're working together, we're getting things written down? How do we move forward and not lose that foundational strength?
Yeah, so I mean, I go back and forth a lot about this, and again, like my experience is more broad probably than the average instructional designer, meaning that like I've done instructional design a handful, as well as a lot of other things. So like mine, I'm not as some of my colleagues who would be more fully in instructional design, they may answer this differently than me.
Sure.
I think what I've really liked, what we've been doing in the Taekwondo course we've been developing for Harness Tech is, and probably I like it because it was my idea, so let's just throw that out there. But if
it works, it works. It don't matter.
Is to, instead of jumping in, I think what a lot of people make a mistake when they're developing a course or a training is they might identify the goals. They might even do what I talked about, developing like user story ideas and maybe even storyboarding out stuff, or action mapping like we've talked about, or all of those things. But then they immediately jump into content. Our human default, I think, is to assume we need content, which is true. We will, because why would they be paying us if we didn't have anything they didn't have? Like
I don't know.
we're not wrong. We do need content, but we don't start there, right? So if we've identified the value statements through the user stories, we've identified what we need them to be able to do, and then maybe we've mapped that out a little bit more. Whether through, in Will and I's case, we did that more through kind of storyboarding and stuff, but like mapping out then what they need to do, what things they need. Then I'm going to go to, okay, if they need to be able to do this, how are we going to assess that they can do that? Okay, so I'm going to go to assessment first. I'm going to identify assessments. right? And go, how am I going to assess doing this? And this even works for training. We're talking about this right now for some of our trainings that we're planning to do for faculty, where it's like, I've been pushing really hard to say, we don't need to just lay out what we're giving them. We need to lay out how are we going to evaluate or assess that they got this. Okay, so if we're going to do that, then we go through, and I actually picked this up just recently through a different team member, is this idea of supporting content then. Okay, so if we're going to assess this, then what content supports this? And this is backwards design. It's going, okay, what assessments are going to build me up to that final thing, right? So there might be a bigger assessment. Well, if I need to get them there, what smaller things do I need them to be able to do, and how am I going to assess those things, and kind of scaffold that out to identify your different assessments, and then go, okay, what content then do I need to support this in there as well? So in other words, what did the learner in earlier steps, when I'm identifying who the learners are and what their gaps are, then what knowledge am I going to need to fill in those gaps so I can assess this? Right?
Yeah.
And that's going to look differently. Like for full out courses, it may be a ton of assessments. For a singular 45-minute training that you may do, your assessment may be super light. And so, okay, what content am I going to need to be able to give them to get to that assessment or that goal?
The irony though about that relationship to courses and training, because folks, we're splitting the line. Like we build both of these things. I've delivered more training than I've ever delivered courses personally. I've designed courses and trainings, but like when you think about a course, we almost always assume a length of time, especially higher education. It's going to be a semester's worth of time or whatever. But like a training is typically happening in 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. And in many cases, training relates to on-the-job development. It's hopefully developing someone's skills or abilities to do something for business or for work purposes. So if it's faculty, it's how to use a tool, it's how to design better, it's how to make better videos, whatever, right? Like whatever you're trying to help your faculty do. And in my experience, I've been away from training faculty for some years now, but my past in that is nobody ever wanted an assessment. Anytime I tried to work with a stakeholder about like, so how are we going to make sure the faculty know this? The best we were allowed to do was a handout. Well, you can give them something they go away with. Well, why can't I test their knowledge? Why can't I make them try and go through the practice? Those losing that space for assessment in the training world kind of shoots this whole thing in the foot. It just becomes a brain dump. Like, oh, I'm just gonna dump information on you today. Good luck. Whereas this process, whether you apply it to a course or to training, you're saying first and foremost, how am I going to ensure, as best as we can observe, that the learner in the course of the training knows what they're talking about? And I'll say from the work Josh and I are doing, I'll get to building some of the content stuff and I get stuck in this. As an SME, I get stuck in this. There's so much content in my head. How do I possibly identify the best assessments, plural? When I'm trying to just teach them one thing in my head, well, that one thing typically is built of 28 other things. And Josh is great at helping me work this out, but that's our role as designers, as support to faculty or to subject matter experts writing courses. We're helping them chunk it down. So this first thing here, once we've gotten past the foundational elements, is to say, what are your assessments? Because that assessment step is going to help us identify if there's more or less chunks to get to.
Yeah.
The faculty member already be thinking like, oh, there's only 5 units in there's only 5 lessons in this unit. We get to some of the assessments. It's like, you're talking about things that's going to take a lot more information here than just that. Like maybe what you were thinking is 1 unit, based on the assessment you're talking about, could actually be 2 full units. We need to actually make this bigger than it was. This becomes really good, I think, conversational space with your SME. Hey, you came up to this with this expectation. We put this assessments down on paper, and now we're seeing that we probably have to adjust. And that's where these conversations can either hopefully build rapport with the faculty and make the relationship stronger, where it's like, hey, okay, maybe there's something we're going to have to cut this time and we'll put it into a revision cycle for future. But right now we need to get through the fact that, in unit 2, the assessment you're talking about is not probable. It's not really functional for what we're talking about. So what do we do instead? How do we make the next best attempt at getting to the information that you're trying to go for in this unit without sacrificing the whole design process. Like Josh and I are trying to work linearly through here, talking from the beginning to the middle end, and then launching the course is kind of the goal with this conversation. But we all know at any one of these stages, the whole thing could get into jeopardy if we lose the SME, if the relationship crumbles, if we have too many assessments. There's any one of these variables that can play a big role in the successful course. And I know we've both seen them fall apart.
Oh yeah, and I've done them myself. Like if I'm taking these principles,
Right.
I wish I could go back and redo certain things I did, right? So like I once did this like 2.5 hour training on how to build a course in Canvas when we were migrating our faculty from Schoology to Canvas. This training like has just burrowed space in my head for eternity because it was like the worst training to lead. It was like we had decided we were going to show them how to do certain parts, and then they were going to have to do it themselves, right? And do them. But there was no possible way we could assess in that training itself without doing extensive other stuff afterwards whether or not we were successful, other than the like byproduct of seeing what a couple of them were doing in the training, right? And so if I could go back and redo that, I would acknowledge that that was way too much to try to bite off in a training, right? So I have options. Do I change the modality of the training? Like if my goal is to be able to train them and assess that they can set up their first course in Canvas well, right? And that's not even a great objective. I'd have to tweak that objective to make it an objective and go through the whole user story thing, blah, 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 blah. If that's my overarching goal, right? Then a 2.5 hour training is not the solution. Like I might take that and change that to, I need a course. And in that course, we'll have checkpoints where they build things and then it can be assessed through that method, right? So if that's too big and I'm not allowed to do a course, because these are real things that instructional designers have to deal with every day, where somebody's like, that's great. I'm glad little instructional designer who I pay to know more about training and learning than I do, that you'd like to do something more effective, but I'd only like them to be in a training for 45 minutes. So you can't do that. Well, then I've got to reduce the goals. And those have to be real conversations. It's like, okay, that 45-minute training that you're only allowing me to do, it's not going to teach them how to do all of this. It's just not. There's not a reality where 45 minutes teaches a professor how to change their entire course in Canvas. It's just not a reality. I don't care what world you live in. I don't care how much money we do or don't have. It's not happening. That 45 minutes. And by the way, I'm using this as an example. Nobody put those restrictions on me. By the way, I just point that out. This is my own doing. But like, let's just pretend that that's happened, right? Because I've seen that happen, right? Where you have a restriction of 45 minutes. It's just not going to happen. But here's what can happen in 45 minutes, right? If I can't assess that they're going to be able to build an entire course themselves, you know what I can assess is maybe by the end of that 45 minutes, do they understand the top 5 things or 4 things that they need to do to set up a course well, and then where to find the resources for those things, right? So if I can assess that, then that's going to focus me in the training to go, what content do I need to deliver? Well, in that 45 minutes, then I don't need to deliver every step for how to do things. I need to deliver the 5 major steps and make it clear on where they go to get the more information on doing those 5 major steps, right? So then I can assess at the end of the training through a easy pulse survey and go, you know what are the top 5 steps? What's your takeaways? What are the top 5 steps, right? And the professors or faculty can put those in there, right? Maybe I do it as a multiple choice. I make their lives a little bit easier. Maybe I do it as an open-ended question because I'm a horrible person, and that's probably what I would do. So I would do it as like an open-ended question. They do that, and I can assess whether or not they learned it or not, right? On what they're doing. That's a more realistic place that I can pull myself into, right? So that's why I think I've really leaned on in my later years, if you will, that we need to start with what we can assess to get to our goal. And if what we can assess to get to our goal, we start there, then we'll know what content needs to come in to support that assessment. And that's just backwards design. I'm not like revolutionizing anything with that idea. It's just, I think too many of us skip past that. We skip past what the assessments are, and we go straight to all the different things we think a learner is going to need to get to that goal without actually taking some time to think about what can we actually assess that they got to that goal. And I think that's kind of the middle part. So
Assessment's so important. It's like right here in the context of design, it's helping us kind of set up the skeleton for the course. In the context of learning, it's the only way we know that they've learned, right? Like, it's so important for building the course, and it's so important for delivering the course. You can't you will never have evidence of learning. Yeah, people get out of that's true. That is, it's
Yeah, no, I think starting with assessment is a big piece of it. And this gets me into the next part, the end, right? Is and there's a couple of things I skipped over in the middle, right? If you're developing like an actual online course, things like that, I would encourage iteration is also to do successful. And this actually applies to trainings too. Like, I think everybody who develops some kind of training or course, whether it's long or short, we all seem to have this like complex that like we get one chance to do this.
yeah.
And if we don't do this right, the world is over. And there's also like in everybody's heads, there's like this fictitious like Santa Claus of a course out there that's just perfect, right? Like that's just like it's the perfect course. I experienced this in corporate where it was like the thing was, well, we can't release something bad. Like I mean, I agree, but like what is success look like? What is good?
Yep.
Right. And I think too often we over perfectionize everything. And I think we just have to be okay with releasing something. Because the sooner you release something and you iterate, or the sooner you try something and test it, the sooner you're going to know whether it works or not. And personally, I think the world just needs to be more comfortable with that. Like it's that we keep pretending like we know. And I'm not saying release horrible things, right? Like I'm not saying don't do the right stuff, but we gotta iterate. And sometimes in a project where you're developing a course or training that's online, that doesn't mean you just release it. It might mean that you iterate on that idea, like you build it earlier and get it out there and you test it and you play with it. You know, you get other designers, you get the other developers on the team, you get your SME to try some things out. And you see, does that work? Does it feel right? Does it look right? And then you iterate and you tweak, right? I think I see too many people who like spend forever storyboarding and they get it. And the second it's in storyline or it's in the LMS, it's like you can tell that the ID is aggravated when they get any feedback. Because they're like, no, it's done. I have it in the thing. You told me this is what you wanted. It's in the thing. We need to be more careful and willing to acknowledge that change is going to happen. And that's speaking to myself just as much because I hate changing things after I built it. Like you don't have to tell me twice. So I think iterating is another part of it. But then out of that to the end, to get a successful course, I think you have to identify how are you evaluating whether the course was successful or not. And this is a bigger step than just assessment. Now, sometimes your assessment might be that, right? Like my pulse survey at the end of that short training is probably also going to be the way I'm going to evaluate whether or not it was successful or not. Like at the end of the course, did they get the idea? But there might be longer ways out there. The question is, how are you going to evaluate whether or not the course was successful, right? Like if the course is training and you assessed in the course on stuff, but the course was supposed to teach them enough to be able to do their job, or a faculty member, like my Canvas training, maybe I did a longer course and I was assessing whether they did their first course right or not. But our mark of success is that they were able to launch that first course with their students. I might have to figure out a better way then. How am I going to assess that worked, right? I might set up some kind of system to check, was the course fully set up in Canvas? What was student feedback, right? Like what are the different ways you're going to assess whether that was successful or not? And this gets into the Addy concept that you and I have talked about a lot, Will, which is where like everybody seems to talk about Addy like it stops at I. Like we implemented it and we're done. Like nobody evaluates. You need to have a plan for evaluating whether or not the course was successful or not. You're never going to have a successful course if you didn't actually know if it was successful. Like you need to actually know, did it meet the goals? Did it meet what you wanted?
And that's the relationship to iteration, right? If we get version 1 out there and we evaluate it, now we can work on version 2. No faculty member that I ever worked with kept their course 100% the same every time they touched it. Some kept a lot of stuff or barely touched it, but even the most even a faculty member who did not want to change their course still sent fresh emails every year or something, like, and I know faculty who literally had Word documents with all their emails in it and they just copy and pasted. Like they're finding the best ways to reduce their time effort. But this relationship to iteration and evaluation is so important. If we don't launch something, we cannot find out how well it did. And if we find out how well it did, we can make it better. That's something I've actually had the most space with and the most opportunity with in corporate. Because in corporate, I've had more control over the product to deliver. And I can just say, all right, we're going to put out a version 1 and then make edits and come back around to it.
Yeah, I'd agree.
So,
well, in higher ed, you can do that too. I like the method we've been trying to employ in the space I'm in, which is like now we're doing some work on thinking maybe more of an intentional evaluation after a course. I think we could do a little bit more intentional evaluation on the first release of a course. But we developed an improvement process where like the academic departments who are responsible, the program coordinators who are responsible for these courses, are consistently taking in revision submissions from the faculty who teach it or people who are involved with the course, and they're evaluating when courses may not be meeting the successful standards they're supposed to be meeting, right? And then they're using that, and we're using OSCQR as a standard. If you want to check out OSCQR, it's a great from Online Learning Consortium. It's a great rubric tool for evaluating, and they're using that rubric with the data to then evaluate if the course being successful or not. And depending on what they're coming up with, they're planning out with our team improvement projects for the courses. And these are masterized courses with blueprints and things. It's a whole system. So it looks a little bit different. Your environment, if you're listening, may not need this whole system in place, but they use this to then evaluate whether or not, I think there's a C somewhere in there, by the way. You put OSCQR on the screen. I'm pretty sure there's a C.
I missed the C.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so they're using that system to then improve courses, right? And actually what I really like about what we've put in place, now we're evaluating how successful this was. It's only been the first year of implementing this new process. But what I really like is we defined 2 different levels to improvement. We defined, well, actually technically 3, but I'm going to focus on 2 of them. We defined 2 levels, which is what we call maintenance, and then we call it improvement, right? So maintenance is smaller tweaks to a course that we're just like, this link was broken, or this assignment needs like a minor sentence of clarification or things like that would minorly improve the course, but isn't a lot of effort. That gets submitted and our team takes care of that a lot quicker. Bigger stuff then gets submitted and kind of held to kind of evaluate it as a whole as to whether or not it needs improved. And the 3rd level we have is redevelopment. Like the course just needs completely redeveloped. It's not just we're improving a few things. We need to redevelop the entire course.
Most courses don't need that.
Yeah, well, I mean, they'll eventually need it, right? Any course you've sitting around for more than 5 years is probably going to need fully redeveloped. Especially Tanks 101, man. Tank technology moves like that, you know? Like one day they're just using wheels, and then the next day they're hovering. I don't know. We don't know enough about tanks. We're a horrible tank teacher. I
hope tanks start to hover. That'd be amazing.
That would be cool. I don't know. It's all my sci-fi games. Some of them hover. You know, so I feel like that'd be a cool vibe. Isn't that Halo has a hovering tank, right?
Yeah.
So could be a thing. You know, eventually that changes. So you need to update Tanks 101. Now it involves hover technology, you know?
Right.
So anyway, I just think that's one of the biggest key pieces that I will acknowledge that like we missed for a long time. And myself, like I wasn't evaluating how trainings were being successful, but I've kind of been hammering that drum recently in conversations about training, because I think it's so important is to evaluate whether it's a course or it's training. You need to actually know whether it was successful or not just assume that it was, right? I think there needs to be direct plans to figure that out.
Yeah. All right. We've made it pretty much through a lot of instructional design, course design, how to have a course successful design. But we I don't know, have we hit all points? The end, launch, and review. I mean, they're kind of melding together here.
Our outline was a little. I don't know. Is there anything else you think at the end is important? You know what I mean?
One of the things that I care about is the SME designer relationship, because I think that while it may not have an immediate effect on the the content design. A successful course launch definitely will have some relationship of the, and if you're talking about a fully online course, the SME and the instructional designer are going to be involved at some level, whether it's just the final sign off, whether the SME is actually teaching it as well, whether the designer provides any sort of instructional help or technical help. Like, we all know different designers, different teams do different stuff, right? Some designers, like in my day job, I think the designers, once they've written the storyboard, the blueprint, the objectives, the script, I think once they've written stuff, they're out. Designer's no longer involved even at launch. An experienced designer takes over and a graphic designer gets involved, right? So then there's more people involved at launch than the IDs, and at least in my day job. But towards the end is still just this process of making sure everybody's good. Are we launched? And I think is the SME, some of it's is the relationship good? Like, has the ID made everything the SME is expecting within the scope, right? If we can all hold tight to the scope we set at the beginning, is everybody happy with where it is? And have we signed off and said, hey, we're locked in and we're good to launch? Because one of the things that I've wrestled with time and time again, when there's no control on the design side, is the SMEs or stakeholders above the SMEs just want to keep changing things. There needs to be, at some point, in my opinion, a drop dead date. You cannot edit anymore. Something has to go live. And sometimes it's even day one, things are still being changed once something's put out live. But I'm able to threaten my stakeholders with the fact, like, if you make me change something once the course is live, it resets students' activity. And that really pushes people back a lot of the times. But I don't know.
Yeah, I was thinking, I leaned more into kind of the pedagogical practice stuff probably than the project management side. That's probably going to need to be a whole different episode,
whole different series,
like project management stuff, because I think there's a lot of components, right? Like the goals and user stories and stuff that kind of ties into the project management. But in the middle, I think, in my experience, and this has not been my experience on my current team, but in my experience that we've seen working through Harness Tech with other people and working on corporate side, there's this tendency to want to like set waves of when things are happening, right? So like an ID will be like, I'm going to do all my work during this period, and I'm going to send it to an SME, and they're going to look over it, and then maybe we'll have like a revision period. And like what that ends up doing is resulting in like death by comments so many times. So like my preference, if I can get it, is to work in smaller iterations, right? So I might, like, over 2 weeks, develop a small portion of the course and have the SME review that. Like, I might sit them and depending on the type of project, I'll actually like walk them through it. I won't even just like say what it is. I'll actually, because it gives me a chance to give them some of my internal thinking about why I did certain things that I did, and then they can give feedback in that. And I'll use that feedback to revise that section, but also speak to the other stuff that I end up doing. Right. So like a project management principle that I like to use here is, when I'm looking at those assessments, then I want to prioritize them. What are the most important things, and what are some dependencies? Like, I might have to do this before I do that type of thing. And I lay those out so then we can work through in priority what are the most important things. Right. So like, Will and I were just doing this in the Taekwondo courses that we were working on. We laid out the assessments in a board, prioritize them, and then I started storyboarding those pieces. Now, they were small enough courses, I ended up storyboarding pretty much the entire course, but I storyboarded one course before I sent him the other one. So we got some feedback, we got some ideas that impacted the other storyboard, and so like we were developing on that flow. And so I would encourage that idea. Bring in feedback earlier than later. And it's okay to get feedback when things are unfinished. I just experienced this in a corporate experience where it was like they wanted everybody on the team to check things before it ever got to the client or the subject matter expert in this case. They wanted it like completely refined before it got to them. And I was like, well, that's dumb. Like, they're going to have feedback. Everybody has opinions. It doesn't matter how refined it is. They're going to have opinions. Get them something unrefined so you can get those opinions out earlier, and you can start to figure out what needs to work, right, before you do stuff. And that's just,
And that's where I think that there's a point at which there's got to be a content cutoff, and where I've only allowed, like, did something break? There's got to be a kind of user acceptance testing at some point where it's like, Can they complete it? Does it work? Can they log in? Can they click on links?
Yeah.
Okay. Then it launches. It has to run. I think there's a point where folks outside of our world, they don't understand that like they can't keep editing it. They can't keep providing feedback. There's a point where it's if you still want it to launch on the day you said it wasn't you were supposed to launch, then you have to stop.
You remove deadlines. I think the key that needs to happen is what are non-negotiables that can change, right? So we were just talking about this as reading through this book I referenced, right? Like if you're doing a software training, right, and the software has changed. Now, first of all, I hate that, but it's a reality. Sometimes you're developing trainings while you're developing new software, and you don't have time to wait for the entire software to be done. If that's the case, then you're going to have to update the training. You can't give them inaccurate information. But it's to what degree, right? So like, is the software completely different? Or this section of the software is completely different. Okay, we're going to have to update the thing. We've dealt with this in tutorial development for Harness Tech. Where we're working with clients.
Oh yeah.
And in those cases, the client was totally okay with, we're going to have to delay the deadline because they could go back and say, well, we can't just get you the training on the same day now that you at this day have told us the software has changed. Now, if we knew ahead of time, I remember we were talking about this with our one client. If we had known ahead of time that the software could have changed, it would have changed how we developed the tutorials. We had this conversation, right, where we were developing these tutorials and we developed very final versions of the tutorials because nobody involved knew that the software was going to change. Well, that specific project, the software changed. So we had a conversation with our client. He was a great guy. And we had a conversation. We said, we're not going to be able to not change the software. Like, this is just a reality of what we're dealing with now. He was like, it's just, we got to figure out how to deal with this. So we developed a different plan. What we decided to do, and I remember what we call them rough cuts, right? We developed rough cuts of tutorials where we would go, we're just going to like down and dirty. You tell us on the storyboard what needs to be done.
Quick as possible.
And then we're literally just going to record a rough tutorial. We're not going to like make everything perfect. We're not going to even clean up text. We're gonna make a real rough cut that takes us like half the time, right? And so in an example of like for those of you who are storyline developers, an example of what this might be is I might create a really loose storyline version of the course where like I haven't worked out all of the variables or all of the triggers, or an academic course. This might be like some of my links work, but for the most part it's all over the place. The course is kind of rough, right? It's not polished, right? Things aren't quite in the order they should be just yet. And so we created that rough cut. And what we did is we sent it to him for feedback. And what he would do is he would leave us feedback, but the plan was we wouldn't act on that feedback. What we do is we'd do a bunch of rough cuts for the tutorials that we knew we needed. We'd record general feedback. And then we had a cutoff date in the project where we said like software changes, we cannot accommodate them after this date. Like, it's just reality. We are not going to be able to release your tutorial on this date if you do software changes after this date. Because I do think some of the people who are like, let's accommodate changes all the time, this is dumb, guys. We can't do that all the time. You can't just accommodate every change no matter when it happens. I love Agile, and that's not going to happen. Like, it's just a reality, right? So, like, we had a cutoff. And the goal was anything we knew was finalized by that cutoff, we'd apply all the final feedback. We'd create a final version of the tutorial. The tutorials that we didn't know, like we hit that cutoff and they're like, we're still working with the developer to work out these bugs or this issue. We just hold the rough cut. Let's say, we'll hold the rough cut. This is what it's going to be like. If they had kind of released features to people, we'd release the rough cut, as a tutorial. But we wouldn't do much. We wouldn't waste time polishing that tutorial because we knew in 2 weeks it could change when they finished the software. So we left that sit. What that did was it created a system that anticipated change, and it went pretty well. Like, the feedback we got from that client was he actually really liked that workflow. We ended up not continuing with it later, but that was just because people didn't have time to continue with it, so we had to kind of reduce what we were doing. But overall, when we were doing it, it worked really well. We were able to efficiently get tutorials out and adapt when things didn't go the way we wanted to. So all that to say is, you can deal with all of that stuff. You can have hard cutoff dates, but just it's okay to also build a system that adapts if you all in the project understand what's going to happen when we hit that cutoff date or how we're going to do it. I think it's just coming to an agreement together about this. I've worked with too many people who will go, well, if they change the software past this date, I'm not changing anything. It'll be like, did you tell them that? Well, no, because they're not going to want to hear that. okay, well, you still need to tell them, or you're not going to Will's point, it's not going to be a successful course because your relationship with the SME and the business partners, the clients, isn't going to go well. And then it's not going to be a good course at the end of the day because people aren't going to enjoy working together.
And it'll just get cut next cycle. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
yes.
those are things where we put all the effort into it and then the course gets cut later because it didn't do what it was supposed to.
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways to handle that component, but I think this might be another. We are going to be doing a series this year on how to like develop training and how to develop like what our method is. Harness Tech as a company that runs this podcast is into the training space, and we're actually clarifying that this year for anybody who would like training who's listening to this podcast. But we're going to talk about like our methodologies behind some of that. We'll get into some of the project management style stuff around there too. So anyway, wow, that was a lot more action-packed than I anticipated. It was a little bit more. You got me a little bit more on soapboxes than I intended to be this episode. So.
I love it, you know, because like you've got these gold mines you're sitting on, dude. So we get it out there. No, that's episode 178. Today we were getting into a successful course, how to design it. Hopefully some takeaways for you, and there will always be information on the website about this episode for you to check out later in the future. Next episode 179, we're going to get into something a little more lighthearted, kind of in the maybe the attitude or the essence of the roasteries. But this time we're just going to do a hot takes episode about tech and L&D. So hot takes still to come, but tune in next time for a couple of laughs and maybe some vicious conversations. We'll see how
how it's going to go. It's going to be some high tech hot takes. As we've termed it, and Will and I are coming into that episode. Yeah, Will and I are coming into that episode next week. We have not told each other our hot takes ahead of time, so you might hear some fun banter.
I hope we bring like
next week
the same ones. I hope we manage to bring like the same hot take.
I hope 50% of our hot takes are the same. And I hope the other 50% we entirely disagree on, which it's totally possible. Will and I have a lot of things we agree on and a lot of stuff we don't agree on. So I think that'll be a fun time.
It'll be great. Until then, folks, reminders always find us on the socials. All that is on screen currently at High Tech Podcast or at High Tech Pod. Email us if you have anything you want to be on the show, any guests, sponsorship ideas, et cetera, et cetera. We're open. Put something into our inbox at hightechpod.us. And we'll get it started. Head over to our website, hightechpod.us, for an episode page for every single one of our episodes and all the things that we do over at hightechpod.us. This is a wrap on another week of Empowering Minds.
Embracing Tech.
Cheers.
Cheers.